I'm talking today to Dr. Harvey Bender. Dr. Bender was born in Humble, Texas, 1933, sort of at the beginning of the Depression. His family raised cattle and was in the timber business there. Dr. Bender finished his schooling in Humble, Texas, and then entered Texas A&M as a pre-veterinary student. He was admitted to the Texas A&M Veterinary School 2 years later, and during that year, he applied to the Baylor University School of Medicine. I'm going to get him to tell us about that because it's an interesting story. He graduated from Baylor in 1959 and was accepted as an intern at the Johns Hopkins Medical School, an intern in surgery. 2 years later, he served 2 years in the public health service with Glenn Marr at the National Institute of Health. He came back to Hopkins to complete his training in 1967 and stayed on the full-time faculty. In 1971, he was invited to become the chairman of the Department of Cardiac and Thoracic Surgery at Vanderbilt, a position he held for 25 years until he resigned and then subsequently retired in 1998. He's the past chairman of the Board of Thoracic Surgery. He's the past president of the Southern Thoracic Surgical Association. He's the past chairman of the Board of Regents of the American College of Surgeons, and he was the president of the American College of Surgeons for the year 2000 and 2001. I'm going to begin by asking Dr. Bender to tell me a little bit about growing up in Humble, Texas, about his schooling, about his friends, and about deciding to be a veterinarian.
Well, Humble was a small town near Houston, and I'll make one correction. I was not born in Humble. I actually was born in Corpus Christi, and it was during the Depression, and my dad was down there trying to get a little work, and finally got a job in the oil fields down there, working 6-hour shifts where they were trying to employ more people. But that's where I was born. But I grew up in Humble, and that was home. Humble had a population of about 1,200. The school building was quite old, same building that my father had attended school in, and some of the same teachers that taught him were teaching when I came along. Was a community that was truly like a huge extended family. There was nothing that you did or thought about doing that was not known by someone in town, and kept the kids on a pretty straight and narrow path, and was a terrific place to grow up. You had tremendous freedom to do things, and you know, every day after school it was, you know, you were horseback off in the woods somewhere, or you were fishing or doing some activity that was quite pleasant. I decided to go to college because, and not many people out of my high school class went to college. The agriculture teacher was very important in my growing up, and he encouraged me to attend college, said that there was more than getting out of high school and going to work in the oil field, which is what most everyone did down there. And and I was very interested in the ranching cattle business, but I was fascinated by the science in high school, and so I decided that the thing to do was to be a veterinarian. So I went to A&M, which at that time was the veterinary medical school for 4 contiguous states. There were 12 vet schools in the country then, and A&M being one of those. And it was a very selective process to get into vet school. We had 50 in our class. They were very bright. They were all males, and most of them grew up in agricultural environments in Texas or the surrounding states. But then after I got into vet school, it became clear that veterinary medicine was becoming more a small animal practice, and what I was interested in was the large animals, having grown up with horses and cattle and things like that. At the Christmas break of my first year in vet school, I had a friend whose father had died, and so I went to the funeral. It was in a surrounding town, a nearby town, the other side of Houston. And as I was driving back, I had my suit on, and I noticed that I was driving right by the Baylor University College of Medicine, and I thought, well, I'll just stop in there and see what it takes to become a doctor. And it was a vacation time. The students were gone. Well, a very nice lady in the administration office talked with me for a while, learned a little bit about what I'd done in college, and said, well, why don't you fill out an application? So I filled out an application, and she said, there are a couple of people here that are professors that are on the admissions committee, and if you'd like, you can visit with them. So I visited with them. And after the Christmas break, I got back to A&M, and there was a letter from Baylor said, send $50, you've been accepted into the next year's class, which points out more than anything else the enormous difference in the way you can get into medical school now as opposed to the way you could get into medical school in 1955. But I had to do one course in quantitative analysis that I'd not had that next semester, and then I took just sort of great fun courses for the second semester of that year after dropping out of vet school, and went to medical school. And as good fortune would have it, I wound up in a medical school that was truly on the leading edge of cardiovascular surgery, and was just pure good fortune. And it was a small medical school. Obviously at that time were not very selective in their admissions process, but they had a faculty that was incredibly exciting and terrific to be a part of.
Tell me about some of those. You ran the pump, you told me, for Dr. DeBakey. Tell me about both of those things, running the pump and what it was like, and what Dr. DeBakey was like.
Well, it was, Dr. DeBakey was a fantastic man. He had been in Houston about 10 years, I think, when I came. And Dr. Cooley had been there maybe 7 or 8 years. There was a very small surgical faculty, a smaller medical faculty. The medical faculty, full-time faculty, consisted of 2 people. Surgical faculty consisted of about 4 people. Dr. DeBakey, Dr. Cooley, Dr. George Jordan, and Stanley Crawford, and a young man who had just finished training at the Brigham named Jim, something that I'm blocking on his name. But at the end of the freshman year in medical school, I got a job working as a scrub technician at the Jeff Davis City Hospital. So I came in contact with all the surgical house officers that were training, but not any of the surgical faculty, and it just happened to be a summer job. And then the following year, Dr. DeBakey had the habit of, at the end of the sort of preclinical years, he got a list from the dean's office the sort of upper part of the class, and he offered those students employment in the Department of Surgery. And if you know, then you got assigned to one of these full-time people that were in the department, and worked really quite closely with them. And my job happened to be running the heart-lung machine for Dr. Cooley, since Dr. DeBakey didn't know open cardiac surgery at that time. Was running the heart-lung machine when the very first few cases were done in Houston. I remember having a big party, going water skiing, having a lot of hamburgers and beer when we did the 100th pump case in Houston. And so you had the opportunity to work with these people on a daily basis and see the enormous energy, the brilliance that both, I mean, Cooley and DeBakey were both incredibly bright. They were superb technical surgeons, very different operating style. Dr. DeBakey was very meticulous and very precise in his operating. The dissections that he did looked like an anatomy illustration. Dr. Cooley had this sort of innate ability to always make the right move. He always knew when he could do something, when he couldn't do something, how to make it work, and how to do it with the fewest possible motions. His heart-lung machine was designed in a way that it was incredibly simple. Very few ways that anything could go wrong. Not very sophisticated, but with its simplicity and its lack of problems and his speed in the operating room, it all worked and got very good results very early.
It was a bubble oxygenator of some sort, is that right? Was it a stainless steel? It was not the plastic screen deal.
No, it was originally a stainless steel bubbler that was about a foot tall, I guess, maybe 15 inches, and about 6 inches in diameter. There was a central hollow core, and at the bottom of that was a plate that so that when venous blood and oxygen were passed through that plate, made bubbles, and then it bubbled up to the top of that central tube, and then went around the outside as a helix, and debubbled during that transit around the cylinder, and then was pumped back into the patient as arterialized blood. The venous blood and the arterial flow were both pumped at that time.
What sort of cases was he doing then?
Well, it was primarily congenitals because we didn't have good valves, and the mitral valve operation was primarily for mitral stenosis and was done as a closed procedure. There were some attempts to do mitral reparative surgery for mitral insufficiency, but not a great deal. And during the time that I was there, the first ventricular aneurysms were resected. But most of the procedures were congenitals. They were ASDs, VSDs, endocardial cushion defects, tetralogies, pulmonary stenosis, things of that nature, and things that he could do within about a half hour. Beyond that, the pump was the risk of being on the pump went up a great deal.
Was that because it was a low flow, or was that
Low flow, and we didn't have a really good system of returning blood to the oxygenator.
Oh, yeah.
So blood that was lost in the operative field was lost.
Yeah.
And we hadn't figured that out yet.
You told me once about helping Dr. DeBakey through an aneurysm when
well, it was
a moment of uncertainty.
The moment of what I thought was death. And not only the patient's, but mine. Dr. DeBakey occasionally would go to the Jeff Davis Hospital and do a case. And then one day, the word came that Dr. DeBakey was going to do needed to pump at the Jeff Davis Hospital the next day because he was going to do a thoracoabdominal aneurysm and wanted to bypass while he did the aneurysmectomy. So the pump team then consisted of a nurse that was a full-time, year-round employee and 2 students. I was finishing my sophomore year, and another student was finishing his junior year. So the 2 students were dispatched to go help Dr. DeBakey. Dr. Cooley kept the nurse, the professional, with him that day. So we headed out to the Jeff Davis, and the plan was to fill a piece of plastic Tygon tubing with saline, pass one end to Dr. DeBakey to put in the left atrium through a purse string suture, and the other end into the femoral artery where the blood would be, having already been oxygenated through the lungs, would be pumped to the femoral artery so that the aorta could be clamped for the aneurysmectomy. The pump we had was a Sigma motor pump, and a Sigma motor pump was a finger pump that it'd have a base over here, and a tubing would be in there, and these little fingers would massage the tubing and pump blood. And so I had this sterile Tygon tubing all filled with saline, and Dr. DeBakey was operating away. There was great tension in the operating room. And so I handed him one end of it. I said, Dr. DeBakey, this goes in the left atrium. Okay, he did. And then I was busy. Then I handed him the other end. I said, you know, this goes in the femoral artery. And then in a couple of minutes, he said, okay, turn the pump on. So I turned the pump on, and the old pump was giving it this, and I could see blood coming down the tube that was connected to the femoral artery, going towards the pump, and then would subsequently go to the left atrium. You know, and I had visions of us just pumping the arterial blood into the left atrium and having the patient go into immediate heart failure. And my partner in crime, the student that was 1 year ahead of me, left the room. He was gone. And so I was sort of hanging onto the table, and the lights were going out when the old pump finally caught and the blood started going in the proper direction, and things worked out all right.
There's no answer for this, but I think it's curious that all pumps have the DeBakey pump, the roller pump. They're all known as the DeBakey pump. There's DeBakey using the finger pump. I think it's curious.
Well, the DeBakey pump was, of course, a pump for transfusion.
Yes.
And it was a small pump, and it hadn't really caught on as...
hadn't become part of heart-lung machine
right,
then. That's
no,
right.
And I think a lot of the early pumps were Sigma motor pumps.
That was some sort of an industrial pump, I
right.
guess.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, now, the third person who was there was Stanley Crawford.
Right.
He was a talented surgeon also.
Very talented. From a little town in Alabama, the name of which I can't remember right now. But he was this a very sort of low-key person, but was one of the finest technical surgeons I've ever seen. He could operate so fast, so well, was very bright, It was, it could do the most difficult cases with essentially, you know, no help. I mean, he just, I remember later when I was a senior student, and the guy that had been with me pumping that case for Dr. DeMakey was an intern. You know, Stanley had a patient on a schedule that day for a Whipple procedure. And he had, for help, he had the intern and me, the senior student. And he did the operation, and I'll never forget it, 1 hour and 29 minutes. And never stopped talking the whole time, you know. You know, criticizing the way we were helping or what we were doing, or didn't our mothers ever teach us better manners, or, you know, all these things just going on constantly. And when I was a student before that, one day it was late one evening. We were sort of about to get out of the operating room when he said, "Harvey, you have a few minutes?" And I said, "Oh, sure, Dr. Crawford. What do you need?" He says, "They've got this patient out at the Wright Clinic in Houston, which was out on the north side of Houston. Little hospital, must have had maybe 10 beds, that had a big abdominal aneurysm." And so the two of us went out there, and he did this aneurysm resection at the Wright Clinic. You know, it never, I mean, it was just no problem. Just, guy was really a good surgeon. Great bird hunter. And
it's also ironic that he died of carotid artery disease, I suppose. He had a big stroke, don't you think?
It sounded like it, yeah.
Yeah, in an operation that could easily have been done, that
Right.
he did himself.
Right.
A sort of a sad sort of a circumstance,
Right.
I suppose. Well, you could have stayed there with the great surgical service that they had, but you decided to go to Hopkins.
Well, they had a tremendous service, and they had great attending surgeons that were doing a lot of work. It was not, at that time, it hadn't really gotten set up as a good training program. They hadn't figured all that out. They were very busy clinical surgeons. And Dr. Cooley, who was, you know, sort of a role model that, you know, here was this guy that was young, handsome, athlete, you know, all Southwest Conference basketball player, you know, most attractive sort of person, that very bright, and doing these cases that only a few places in the world could be done. And he had trained at Hopkins, and so that was stimulus, I think, to make application to the Hopkins Hospital for training. And when I got there, it became very clear very quickly that it was a totally different environment. They were doing heart surgery, we were doing all kinds of surgery, and they had a lot of good surgeons. But the place was set up to train people, and it had a system that worked very well. I think, you know, as you've been interviewing a number of people that were pioneers in the field of cardiac surgery, you interviewed a number of people that came out of that residency. I think at the time I was there, it was sort of the tail end of that sort of golden era, I think, during Dr. Blaylock's tenure. And well, I think things had been much more flexible early and less organized. But when I came along, I think they had developed a structure that I thought was very well thought out and really designed to bring people along with graded responsibility and result in a well-trained surgeon.
Dr. Blaylock was still there when you
He was. He was there. I came in '59 and he died in '64. But I was away a couple of those years. But he was there for a part of my training, and got to operate with him a number of times.
Tell me what he was like to operate with, and what he was like as a person.
Well, he was a consummate gentleman. and incredibly well prepared. I'll give you an example. When my wife Doris and I had a 3-year-old son when we arrived in Baltimore, and that was, I mean, Baltimore at that time was pretty grim around the hospital. It was a bad place to live, and that's where we all had to live. And but Dr. Blaylock, right around the 4th of July, had a tea for the new interns and their wives. And he had a little library across from his office. And they had this tea. And, you know, I didn't know whether he had any idea who I was or what I was interested in, where I was from, or anything. But when we walked into the tea and Doris was introduced to Dr. Blaylock, was talking with him, he asked her how her 3-year-old son was and did he manage the trip all right, which was, gives you an idea of the way he prepared and how thorough he was in everything he did. And when he had, that's the way he approached every patient that he operated on. He had a lot of help from the residents, and that he would tell, you know, he made it clear to the resident that he wanted to get all of this information. So the resident then headed to the library and got everything that could be known about the problem. And then he and Dr. Blaylock would meet and they'd go over it all. And Dr. Blaylock, you know, had his memory refreshed, and the resident learned everything there was to know and how Dr. Blaylock thought about this particular clinical problem. And that went on every day. The resident met with Dr. Blaylock every day in his office. Actually, 2 residents did. One was the resident on the cardiac surgical service, and the other was the chief resident on the surgical service. So it was an incredible learning experience. They started that, the program at that time consisted of taking, in my group there were 17 interns. Without ever meeting Dr. Blaylock to talk about your plans, you did meet with Hank Bonson, and I remember meeting with Hank Bonson and David Sabiston together in an office one day, sort of asking me, was I interested in remaining and things like this. And then you got a note towards the end of the year saying, you know, that I got a note saying I'd been invited to become a first-year assistant resident. And there were 4 of us that got that, so we went from 17 to 4. Can't do that now. But in my own mind, I think that to train really good surgeons or really good people in anything, you don't take just everyone that wants to be one. You take the ones that sort of settle out and appear to have something extra. And in the fall, about November of my 2nd year training, 1st year assistant resident, got a page, Dr. Blaylock's telephone number, which threw sheer panic in me, but I called it. And his comment was, Harvey, you have an appointment next Friday at 10 o'clock to meet Glenn Morrow at the National Heart Institute. He has a job for you. And call Dick Anderson and tell him he has an appointment too. I mean, that was so the 2 of us then went down, met Glenn, and then that following July went to the NIH, which was again, very well structured and all related to how Dr. Blaylock wanted things to be. And he had never asked either Dick or I whether we wanted to do cardiac surgery. He just assumed that's what we wanted to do because that was the thing that was sort of new and most interesting.
Well, that brings up that particular circumstance brings up something that is very striking about Dr. Blaylock was that he was, how do you think that he became so powerful in his relationships with everybody. He could call people up and get people jobs. He could call people up and get people placed. What characteristic of his put him in that position, do you think?
I don't know. It's, you know, it's always hard to identify the feature that makes one individual powerful and influential and another individual that may have the same intellect that doesn't. So I think that's hard to come by. At the time, you could see how Dr. Blaylock introduced an operation that opened a whole field of surgery that was very exciting.
No doubt.
Operate on the human heart. That caught everyone's attention worldwide. And in the next couple of decades, he trained an enormous number of very powerful people, very bright, technically gifted, that were scattered to the winds doing cardiac surgery and heading important surgical departments. So I think he had enormous influence. And I mean, the program at the NIH was set up so that, you know, spent 1 year in the research laboratory that was, I mean, it was the easiest place to be in a research laboratory that you could imagine. I mean, you didn't have to worry about a budget. Anything you wanted to do, you could do. There was funding for it. It was well equipped, well staffed in the lab. So you could, you know, crank out papers and do really just about anything you wanted to do. So you did that for a year. Then the next 6 months, you know, became the cardiac cath laboratory at the NIH was run by a surgical associate, which is what we were called. And so for 6 months then, all the caths were done by me, or I would help and teach some of the cardiology fellows that were at the NIH to do caths. And there were 4 guys that became president of the American College of Cardiology that I taught to do caths when I had 2 years of surgical training and a year in the lab. And and that every Sunday, all the patients were admitted on Sunday at the NIH. They were admitted, and you would meet with Gene Brownwall and go over all these patients after you had them worked up and sort of plan the week's cath schedule. And you do the caths and then present the work on Friday. And that went on for 6 months. It was absolutely terrific. And then the last 6 months was the first assistant in the operating room. When things really turned around, we had a valve that worked in a mitral position, and for the last 3 months I was there, we had a valve that worked in an aortic position, and it just, all of a sudden, patients that had been dying were living, and it was a very exciting time.
That was a star valve?
Yep.
Now before that, you told me that some of the aortic patients, they had high risk, high mortality.
High mortality. We're trying to, you know, sew in cloth valves, trying to debride valves in patients with aortic stenosis to remove the calcium and make the valve more pliable and things like this, but very high mortality. And it turned around just, you know, with the first case, things were different with the star valve in the aortic position.
So after that experience, you went back to Hopkins?
Went back to Hopkins, and again, this sort of structured program.
And Dr. Blaylock died in that interval, is that correct?
No, he died after I was back.
Oh, yeah.
When you came back from the NIH, you spent 6 months in surgical pathology, which if you look at now, the residents don't spend any time in surgical pathology. But you spent 6 months in surgical pathology in which you cut specimens every other day, and there were 4 pathology house officers that rotated the alternate day. So you got a tremendous experience in surgical pathology and an opportunity to read and to learn about the things that you know, were going on in the surgical field. The next 6 months was another rotation that's unusual that you don't see now on the in training programs, was 6 months of plastic surgery. While Dr. Blaylock did not get along particularly well with the chief of plastic surgery, but Dr. Blaylock thought that the things you could learn in plastic surgery with respect to handling tissue, you know, rotating flaps, making the flaps so that they would be viable, and learning about spatial relations were very important in surgery. And I really think that that's right. I think, you know, if you wind up doing intracardiac surgery, you've got to be able to visualize things in 3 dimensions, and you've got to be able to think in 3 dimensions and do the procedure in 3 dimensions, and yet all the information you're getting before you go into the operating room is in 2 dimensions. So I thought it was very helpful to have that 6 months of plastic surgical experience. Then after that, you did 6 months of pulmonary surgery at a TB hospital, which was a great experience. And then you did 6 months of cardiac surgery, in which at that time, this was before Medicare, and there was a big ward service at Hopkins. And if a patient came in the hospital, the patient either came in to one of the, you know, on the service of one of the attendings, or he just came in on the ward service. And during the time that you were the resident on that service, every ward patient that came in was your patient. Always on the heart service was always had an attending as an assistant in the operating room. You didn't do anything on your own, as opposed to the other services like in general surgery. So that you always had an attending, but it didn't make any difference how easy or how difficult it was. That was your patient, and you had responsibility for it. And then after that, that got me, you know, there were still 2 more years of training to go. And that was back to general surgery then. And that 1 6-month period, you worked for 3 months on the private general surgical service, with a lot of private general surgery, big operations. So you were the assistant and ran the private service. There were 3 private services, but that senior person sort of ran all 3, and then you spent 3 months in the emergency room, sort of doing all the surgery that came through the emergency room. And then the last 6 months, you spent 3 months with each of the outgoing chief residents as sort of a kind of a finishing time. They were sort of phasing out, you phased in, and got to do bigger and bigger cases. And then the next year was, you had a 25-bed ward that was your service, plus you had admitting privileges to the hospital, and any private attending that wanted to send you a patient, you know, you could admit to the rest of the hospital. And it was a very good way to train people. And that way, as soon as I got there after leaving Houston, I mean, I realized it was a very different environment, and it was set up to train people to do surgery.
And you lived at the compound then?
Yeah, the first year we lived in a row house right across the street from the psychiatric hospital. My son played in the playground at the psych hospital, and we had this great row house that it was just a concrete sidewalk, little marble steps with a sign on it that said "Keep off the grass." There wasn't any grass anywhere around, and it was a 3-story building, and it was typical sort of shotgun row house. Had a door and a long hallway that went down from the door, and there were rooms off to the right, but those on that ground floor, those rooms were occupied by an ophthalmology resident and his wife. And then there were stairs that went up to the 2nd and 3rd floor, which is where Doris and I lived with our son. They had a bathroom and kitchen sort of nailed onto the back of the building. Those were obviously not part of the original buildings. They were great, great facilities. But it was took a little getting used to the fact that there was someone else, it's just some total strangers living in this house with you with no door that separated your house and their house. Then after that, we lived in a compound, which was about the, I mean, it was about the lowest building cost ever. I mean, this was the flimsiest little apartments down there. But everyone lived there, and everyone knew each other, and so the call schedule didn't bother you very much. You were sort of doing what you wanted to do. It was tough for the wives, but they were very supportive of each other, I think, and became very good friends.
You stayed on the faculty, and you've told me about your salary structure. Tell me about that. The salary structure at Hopkins.
Minuscule. It was very low. It was a little more, you got paid a little more than the chief resident.
What did chief resident get?
Chief resident was making about $10,000 or $12,000 a year, it seemed like at the time I finished. And it went up to 18 as a faculty member. It didn't go up very much over the next several years.
So you stayed there. Now, you stayed there 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, 4 years.
69,
67 through, and I left in 71.
Yes. Now, you told me once, and I think it's right, that during that time, that was the time of the heart transplant, the first big bulge of heart transplant patients. And y'all did one there.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
68.
That must have been a pretty interesting experience.
It was very interesting. It was one of those things you knew that were being done around, and you couldn't wait to get one to do. And so we did one that was interesting. We did our first heart transplant before we did a kidney transplant. We were getting geared up to do that, but we got a heart first. And
what was the circumstance of the recipient and the donor?
The recipient had had rheumatic fever, had mitral stenosis, mitral valve replacement elsewhere, reoperation, a lot of trouble, and just wound up with just sort of a heart that was just whipped and poor left ventricular function. And the donor was a gunshot wound head that and operated in the next room. Pronounced dead in the operating room as they were done at that time.
Your patient then, that heart transplant patients all had problems detecting rejection episodes.
A lot of problems,
Yeah. They've tried to do with EKG and all that sort of thing.
And it was, the patient lived 4 or 5 months and finally died. Was never really well.
You told me your practice there also was mixed, general surgery, thoracic surgery.
Yeah, Dr. Blaylock he didn't really believe that you were going to be one kind of a surgeon or another kind of a surgeon. He thought he trained surgeons that did different things. And he thought that all their training ought to be pretty much the same, no matter what they were going to do. And he thought, that cardiac surgical training would make you a better general surgeon or whatever. But that was not original with Dr. Blaylock. That was sort of the way it was before. For example, during the 30s at Hopkins, the sort of premier rotation for the residents in training was to be on the so-called brain team with Walter Dandy as a neurosurgeon who was very prominent. And people spent about 2 years on the brain team. The best residents were allowed to spend 2 years on the brain team. And then many times they'd finish that and then go off and hit a general surgery training program or something. They did, but thought that was important in their training. And they sort of continued that when we came along, because not everyone had finished the residency. the residents a year ahead of me, one did cardiac surgery, one did vascular surgery. My co-resident also did cardiac surgery when he finished. The residents the year behind me both did general surgery. The residents the year behind them both did cardiac surgery. It was just, it didn't really determine what you were going to do, but the training was pretty much the same for everyone.
When you stayed on the faculty then, had Dr. Bonson left? Was he still there? Tell me
Dr.
about.
Bonson left when I was at the NIH.
Yes, oh I see.
Frank Spencer, who was then on the faculty, left when I went to the NIH. So they'd both gone. And when I came back, the cardiac surgical service was headed by David Sabiston, Jim Jude, who is famous for closed chest cardiac massage and resuscitation, was attending, and a fellow named Bob Gertner, who actually built the Hopkins first heart-lung machine as a junior house officer. They were the cardiac surgical service, and that was in '63. The next year, in '64, Dr. Blaylock was not well and was nearing his 65th birthday and was going to retire, so they were looking for someone else. And when it became clear that that someone was not going to be David Sabiston, he left and went to head the surgical department at Duke. Jim Jude left to head the cardiac thoracic program at the University of Miami. And Bob Gertner remained and ran the cardiac service for a short time, and then Alec Haller had come back to Hopkins from Louisville, and Larry Weldon, who had finished the residency a few years ahead of me, were doing the bulk of the cardiac surgical work for a number of years until in about 1966, Vince Scott came as the head of the program.
I think then at that era, in the era here, same era at Vanderbilt, probably surgeons consume more alcohol than they do now. But you told me Dr. Black had a couple of rules about alcohol. Tell me what those were.
There were two rules. One was measure all your drinks, so that you used a jigger, you knew exactly how much alcohol you were putting in that glass. And the other rule was don't drink after dinner. And they're both probably pretty good rules. But the fellow that was explaining those rules to me was in the process of measuring his drink in a looked like an iced tea glass. It was a great huge glass, and he measured it for a long time. And then we'd been invited to his house for dinner, and we were told to come early, and he served dinner at 10:30.
No drinks after dinner,
No one drank after dinner.
but dinner didn't occur until 10:30 at night.
Right.
Well, you were invited to come down here to the cardiac surgery program then was being run by Arnold Killen, I guess. Is that right? Or
Hal Collins was still here.
Hal was still here.
And Arnold and a fellow named John Sutton were here.
Oh yeah, Sutton. I'd forgotten about that.
The problem at Vanderbilt at that time, they were having a very difficult time getting things going.
They did have a difficult time.
I think they were, in a trap of, if you don't have sterling results, the patients that get referred are high-risk, difficult patients. And I think they were sort of caught in that. they had a group of cardiologists that were very cautious, conservative, and had no enthusiasm for the operative intervention in heart disease. I think they felt that that was a sort of their defeat if they had to refer a patient for operation. So I think a lot of things were tough. And when I came, Vanderbilt had decided that they would recruit a chief of cardiology, a chief of pediatric cardiology, and a chief of cardiac surgery all at the same time. And I think that was, whoever's idea that was, I think was a really good one. It brought 3 people in with enthusiasm and no history that made it difficult. That made it easy for them to work together, and things did better. And still tough competition in town, as you know.
And Dr. Scott was the chairman then.
Yeah.
How did you enjoy working with Dr. Scott?
Actually, I didn't have any trouble. In general, we got along quite well.
He'd gotten over his interest in cardiac surgery by that time.
He had no interest in doing cardiac surgery. He did not interfere at all in whatever I tried to do. He really, I think part of it was that he, you know, I think he'd sort of been forced to get into this situation in which they brought 3 new people. And I don't think that was his idea. And I think he was not terribly enthusiastic about that. But at the same time, he was totally fair in that he kept hands off and let you do whatever you felt like you wanted to do or needed to do, and was not a hamper in any way. And we became good friends through the years, and was able to get along with him pretty well. He was a remarkable man, in that, I mean, some of the things that he did in running this surgical program, you know, he had put together a training program that I don't know, you know, how it was structured, but it worked, and it turned out a lot of really well-trained surgeons, the bulk of them general surgeons, I think, but a lot of good surgeons came out of the Vanderbilt training program during the time that you were training here, and afterwards, I think.
And then you worked with John Sawyers, who was one of your really good friends.
Yeah, I mean, we've become good friends, and I worked with John pretty well. And
how did you get appointed to the board of thoracic surgery and the board of the American Board of Surgery? How did that come about?
You know, I just got a phone call from Herb Sloan one day asking me if I would serve on the American Board of Thoracic Surgery. The board selects the members of the board. And,
I didn't know that.
And for some reason, my name surfaced. And so I certainly accepted that. And then at my first meeting with the board, they said, we have to have someone to join the American Board of Surgery. And that the American Board of Surgery does this. There's, at least at that time, there were several boards. I think maybe colorectal surgery, pediatric surgery, plastic surgery, cardiothoracic surgery, in which they send someone to that board, and that specialty board sends someone to the surgery board. And it makes it very good for but this was all at the initiation of the American Board of Surgery, I feel confident. Because it helped them know what was going on in the specialties. They had someone sitting in that board meetings. And it helped them write questions for the American Board of Surgery exam that were in specialty areas. So they had someone from the thoracic board to help write the thoracic questions, someone from the plastic board or whatever. So there was a good relationship. So for 6 years then I spent time on both boards, which was...
It's got to be a big commitment of time.
It's a big commitment on the American Board of Surgery. It's an
Yeah.
enormous commitment. It
Yeah.
takes about a month out of town
Ooh.
to serve on the American Board of Surgery.
Yeah.
Because you've got a lot of exams, a lot of question writing, and they're giving those exams all over the country. So it's a long time that you wind up putting in.
You served a long time on the Board of Regents, became the chairman of the Board of Regents, and then you were president of the college. All of that happened over, tell me about the years that happened and the issues that were involved.
I got a call from the chairman of the nominating committee of the Board of Governors asking me if I would be willing to serve on the Board of Regents. I'd been a governor for a little while and had enjoyed that. I have a great deal of respect for the college, and I think most of us, got an opportunity to present our first work or whatever at the college, at the forum. And it was always exciting to go to the college meetings, I think. So I had been involved with them through the years. So I said, certainly I'd love to serve on the Board of Regents. And that basically turns out to be about a 9-year job. The regents are elected for 3 years and can be re-elected twice. So most people will wind up spending 9 years, and I did that, and then I just happened to come along at a time when it was when I was about 2 years away from finishing my term. It needed a new chairman of the Board of Regents, and so I became the chairman. And then from that, it's pretty automatic that the chairman will at some point then serve as a president. President's job is mostly to go around the country to various meetings and things, and not it's not a very difficult job. It's kind of a compensation for having worked in the past on the board.
Tell me some of the issues that the regents deal with in the college.
Well, they really deal with a lot of things. Education has been the sort of cornerstone of the college from its inception. They deal in issues related to the practice of surgery. They have a heavy involvement in Washington, trying to look out for legislation that's going to be make it more difficult to practice, and trying to support legislation that will make the practice easier and to improve patients' access to good surgical care. They're very much committed to the proposition that surgery should be done by surgeons, and that you should look for board certification, evidence that you've got a surgeon that's well trained, well versed in a problem that you happen to have as a patient. They support a lot of research activity. Up until just recently, it was primarily by funding people for career development sort of grants, trainees, fellowships to give them an opportunity to be supported while they pursued research in a given area or things like that. And then in the recent years has kind of gotten involved in the research program itself with the clinical trials program that is now initially in oncology, and that's headed by Sam Wells, that I think has a potential of really giving us a lot of information. It's a very large, broadly based clinical trial program in a variety of specialties and a variety of tumor types. So I think we can look forward to some good productivity in that area. The college has it's a big business. It has a large budget. It's a lot of money that the board is responsible for shepherding and managing that in a way that that continues, and the college will then be able to continue to do the things that it's done by putting on the big meetings and these traveling symposiums and things that the college does. A lot of good things that help surgeons, and you know, because of good fortune in the investment of the endowment, I mean, the dues are minuscule compared to other surgical organizations, and what you get from your fellowship in the college. It's a fairly selective thing. Well, that's not. I mean, it's not overly selective. The college fellowship, though, is it's not just automatic. You don't just sort of sign up and become a member. You that selection is based primarily on local input, and whether you are viewed as the kind of surgeon in your community that they like to see the college made up by.
We've talked about a bunch of different people, that 5 or 6 people that really influenced your life, had a big influence on you. The teacher that almost threw you out of the second floor window, maybe? Or...
Well, I'll start with her. That was Miss Holitsky. Miss Holitsky got my attention when I was in the 4th grade. One is we moved, the 4th grade was housed on the 2nd floor of this little schoolhouse in Humble. And that was a pretty big thing in itself, because that was the only building other than a courthouse in the town that had 2 floors. And so the little kids were nervous up there. And one night I had my friend call me and said, look, they've got a new movie at the picture show. Let's go to the picture show tonight. And so I said, sounds like a great idea. And I talked to my mother, and she said, what about your homework? I said, we don't have any homework tonight. It's just free sailing. So she said, okay. So my friend and I went to the picture show, and the next day, Miss Holitsky wanted to know where my homework was. And I obviously didn't have it, nor did my friend. And she grabbed me by the shoulders, walked over to the 2nd floor window, and held me outside and said, if you come in one more time without your homework, you're going out this window. So she got my attention. And the other man I mentioned earlier was my ag teacher, who was he had gone to A&M, had been a Marine in World War II, and had achieved the rank of Major in the Marine Corps. And they were pretty stingy with rank in the Marine Corps. He was a fantastic man, hard as nails, and a tremendous influence on the young boys in our high school. And so I certainly credit him as someone that was important. And I'd have to say that Denton Cooley was important, and it was this terrific role model that I got to see, and think that, gosh, could you grow up to have a life like that, was terrific. Hank Bonson when I was at Hopkins, I worked with Hank really during my internship and first year assistant residency. But I don't think there was a day that went by in my surgical career that I didn't become aware of something during an operation that either Hank told me about or showed me how to do. He was a fantastic technical surgeon. He would finish the cardiac part of the operation, and we perfused patients through the groin then at that time. And then instead of leaving the operating table for the resident to sort of finish up, he'd leave the resident to take care of the thoracic part, and he'd go down at the end of the table, and he'd show the intern how to sew the femoral artery back together, and how to, pass the suture through and not injure the artery, and all those things that were important. And so he was an enormous influence. And that was Dr. Blaylock, but Dr. Blaylock was a little more removed. I mean, obviously was very influential, but I didn't feel, I think almost no one felt close to Dr. Blaylock. Like of all his residents, they say only Bill Longmire called him Al. None of the other residents did. It was still a very formal relationship. But I think those are probably the ones that were.
Those are good ones. Yeah. Well, the final thing I wanted to ask you about is the changes that are occurring in thoracic and cardiac surgery, and so your opinion about the future of cardiac surgery for a young resident now. What would you say? Would you say it's things are going to be good?
It's going to be very different, Bill. I think one of the things that made cardiac surgery as exciting as it was not just what you did in the operating room, but it was taking an incredibly sick, unstable patient to the recovery room or intensive care unit or whatever, and then using all of your skills as a physician, not the surgeon, but to the physician part of you, to make that patient better, get them well. I thought that was a tremendous part of what we did. What I see now, and I see it sort of from afar, I'm not there firsthand, and but it seems like that surgery is becoming a very technical, operating room based specialty that generates a lot of income, but I don't think it produces the kind of physician that we like to think we were, or when we went to medical school we wanted to be, I think. So that's a little disappointing, but whenever I begin to talk like this, I begin to feel like I'm hearing my grandfather talk about how the world's changed and it's all going to hell. I'm sure it'll work out, but it's going to be different.
There's no doubt it'll be different.
Right.
It is different already.
Right.
Probably. Well, I do thank you for taking time.
Thank you.
Getting dressed up.
My pleasure.
Coming and telling us about the past. I enjoyed it so
much.
Well,
I got my, I ran into John Sawyer's this morning, and he said, boy, you're all dressed up. And he says, I used to buy a new suit every year. And he says, now I just have one suit. That's my funeral suit. That's what you got today.
Well, thank you very much.